Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Monday everybody. After 4 days of private talks in Beijing, China, Iran and Saudi Arabia reached an agreement for the latter two to resume diplomatic relations after 7 years of estrangement. Embassies are set to reopen within 2 months, according to the official statements. Saudi Arabia severed ties with Iran in 2016 after the storming of its embassy in Tehran in an escalating dispute between the two countries. The signing ceremony was held in Beijing on Friday, with China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, expressing that it represents, quote, a victory of dialogue and peace, end quote. In the official statements, the Iranian and Saudi sides both, quote, express their appreciation and gratitude to the leadership and government of the People's Republic of China, end quote. Almost all analysts agree that the surprise announcement is a big diplomatic win for Beijing, and though not particularly damaging for the US, at the very least it's not exactly flattering for the traditional security guarantor of the region. On Friday, John Kirby, US National Security Council spokesman, told media that the White House had been informed of the talks, but were not directly involved in them. He said that the US supports any efforts from Beijing to de-escalate tensions in the Middle East, but added, quote, we certainly continue to watch China as they try to gain influence and footholds elsewhere around the world in their own selfish interest, end quote. Chinese officials and state media will no doubt point to this diplomatic victory to push the idea that China's vision for its world order is one of peace, and perhaps even try to reverse some of its reputational losses among Europeans since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This narrative competition will largely be fought in the global south, however. Much of the West and most key nations in Asia, Japan, South Korea, India, etc., maintain deeply unfavorable views towards China. This development also demonstrates China's growing influence in the region, with several prominent Chinese experts, perhaps indulging somewhat in exaggeration, arguing that Chinese influence is becoming greater than that of the US. What is perhaps a more accurate characterization, however, is that Chinese interests in the region, especially in energy imports, of which China's economy is deeply reliant, is greater than a US now enjoying a net energy exporting North America. Quote, effectively, not only China became the guarantor of this agreement, it also showed that the US can no longer ignore China's role in the security arrangements of the Persian Gulf, a region where the energy reserves and passageways are more important to the Chinese economy than the US, end quote. Though, of course, critically, it is the US military that protects these passageways, not the Chinese. Okay, let's jump from the Middle East to South Asia now. Beijing has signaled that it will support a debt restructuring for the crisis-hit economy of Sri Lanka, a move which could allow the nation to secure a $2.9 billion bailout from the IMF, an application which is expected to be approved by the end of this month. Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis in more than 7 decades, and a shortage of dollars has disrupted imports. Sri Lanka's president told Parliament last week that China had provided written assurances via the Export-Import Bank of China that it would back the plan. The same day, the IMF, International Monetary Fund itself, said that Sri Lanka had, quote, secured financing assurances from China, India, and all its major bilateral creditors, end quote. China's support is important as Beijing represents Sri Lanka's largest bilateral creditor. In total, Sri Lanka owed Chinese lenders $7.4 billion, or nearly 1/5 of its public external debt, as at the end of 2022. China has lent or invested billions of dollars into the developing nation to support infrastructure spending, most famously or infamously, depending on one's outlook, for the deepwater Hambantota International Port, which has been leased to China on a 99-year agreement. China has become the world's largest government guarantor to developing countries over the past decade. Most of that lending has been done by state-owned banks. Some commentators have accused Beijing of lending to vulnerable economies in the region to increase political leverage, a process called debt trap diplomacy, though analysts are still arguing whether this is happening or not. And if so, to what degree? Some analysts even come down on the other side of this debate, arguing that the reason why Chinese lenders are giving so much to risky borrowers is not because they want political leverage, but because they are simply new to the international lending game and they are just not that good at it yet. After all, they argue, the same was seen when Japan, the USSR, and even the US initially entered the international lending market. Sri Lanka isn't the only South Asian economy needing relief from Beijing this year either. Recently, China also extended a $2 billion loan to Pakistan. Next up, is the Chinese economy already in decline? Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit that like button. It's a huge help. And as always, anyone who can go that extra mile and be part of the community that keeps this channel sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Finally, for today's video, I wanted to briefly examine a recent opinion piece, which has been widely shared, called "The Chinese Century is Already Over." This is by Fuxian, a senior scientist and expert China demographer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who has argued for years that Beijing has greatly underplayed just how poor its demographic situation is. In this article, Dr. E argues that Chinese leaders have long staked their policies on the assumption of a rising East and declining West, but China is already past its prime. The gap between its declining demographic and economic strength and its expanding strategic ambitions now constitutes a major geopolitical risk. Let's finish by looking at some of his arguments. Quote, "In January, China officially acknowledged that its population began to decline last year, roughly 9 years earlier than Chinese demographers and the United Nations had projected. The implications of this are hard to overstate. It means that all of China's economic, foreign, and defense policies are based on faulty demographic data. For example, Chinese government economists have predicted that by 2049, China's per capita GDP will have reached half or even three-quarters that of the United States, while its overall GDP will have grown to twice or even 3 times that of its rival. But these forecasts assumed that China's population would be 4 times that of the US in 2049. The real figures tell a very different story. Assuming that China is lucky enough to stabilize its fertility rate at 1.1 children per woman, its population in 2049 will be just 2.9 times that of the United States, and that its key indicators of demographic and economic vitality will be much worse." End quote. In 1950, Japan's median age was 21, compared to 29 in the US. As one would expect, he says, Japan subsequently benefited from years of faster economic growth. By 1994, however, the prime age labor force, 15 through 59, began to decline, whereas the US working age population is not expected to fall until 2048. He continues by stating, by 1992, Japan's median age was 5.5 years above that of America's, and its old age dependency ratio began to exceed that of the US. Not surprisingly, its GDP growth has been lower than America's ever since. Japan's GDP growth per capita rose from 16% at the US level in 1960 to 154% in 1995, but by 2022 that figure had fallen to 46%, and it is likely to decline below 35% in the future. In his article, he then moves to demonstrate similar trends with Taiwan and South Korea, and then turns to China, writing that while China's population was 1.5 times larger than India's in 1975, India is now on track to be nearly 1.5 times larger than China in 2050, with a median age of 39, a full generation younger than China's 57, he says. Quote, By 2030, China's median age will already be 5.5 years above that of the US, and by 2033, its old age dependency ratio will begin to exceed America's. Its GDP growth rate will begin to fall below America's in 2031 through 35, at which point its per capita GDP will hardly have reached 30% of its rivals, let alone the 50 to 75% predicted by Chinese official economists. If the US is overtaken as the world's largest economy, it will be by India, not China." End quote. E explains why he is not impressed with arguments that China will innovate its way out of its aging crisis with technology, and then turns to the theme of decline and geopolitical implications. Quote, "China's decline will be gradual. It will remain the world's second or third largest economy for decades to come. But the huge gap between its waning demographic and economic strength and its expanding political ambitions may make it highly vulnerable to strategic misjudgments. America and its allies are also dealing with societal aging and resulting economic slowdowns. Their combined share of the global economy already fell from 77% in 2002 to 56% in 2021, and that trend will continue. The geopolitical implications should be obvious. If the major powers are wise, they will cooperate in good faith to forge an enduring global order before they no longer have the power to do so." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.